Good afternoon. As we wait for people to connect, I want to thank you for joining us for a timely discussion on Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to the United States and a recent congressional trip to Israel. I'm Brian Romick, and I'm honored to have stepped into the role of President and CEO of Democratic Majority for Israel this past spring. Last week, Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the UN in New York City, and yesterday he met with President Trump at the White House, where the president announced a U.S.-backed proposal to end the war in Gaza, which Israel agreed to, and we're waiting for Hamas's response. Today, I'm grateful that we've convened distinguished speakers to share their insights on this consequential visit and the next steps on the ceasefire proposal. Before I introduce them, a reminder to please consider following us on social media. We're on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. You can sign up for our news updates and on our website, dmfi.org. If you want to ask a question, submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. If you're watching on Facebook, you can enter it in the comments section. Now I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers for today. First up is Congressman Greg Landsman, who represents Ohio's 1st District in the House. A strong advocate for the U.S. Israel relationship, Congressman Landsman has supported robust security assistance for Israel, backed legislation to counter threats from Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and consistently spoken out against anti-Semitism and efforts to delegitimize Israel. He served on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he worked to address issues that impact families every day, from healthcare and energy to consumer protections and public health. Democratic Majority for Israel's sister organization, DMFI PAC, was honored to support his campaign for Congress, helping to elect a steadfast pro-Israel Democrat to represent Ohio in Washington. Congressman Landsman returned from a congressional delegation to Israel, where he met with Israeli leaders, including the Prime Minister, and assessed both the security and humanitarian developments in the region. Additionally, we're joined by Jacob McGeed, the U.S. Bureau Chief for the Times of Israel. Jacob oversees the paper's coverage of American policy, Jewish community affairs, and U.S. Israel relations. He earlier served as the newspaper's settlement correspondent, reporting intensively on West Bank developments and regional politics. Congressman, why don't you start us off with your observations on your recent trip? Then we'll hear from Jacob on the Prime Minister's trip to the U.S. After we hear from our speakers, our Chief Political Officer, Joel Wenger, will lead us in a Q&A session.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, everyone, for joining. Appreciate your work and everything that you do. The trip was productive. We went down to the Gaza envelope. This is my 4th trip since the war started, my 6th trip to the region as a member of Congress in the last 30 plus months, right? This is my 3rd year. So, Middle East peace and the partnership between the United States and Israel is a huge priority for me. One of the reasons why I got involved in politics was the fact that I'm a 90s kid. So I grew up, with Clinton, and I watched Rabin and Arafat and Clinton. And I was old enough, I was in high school then, and I remember just thinking that would be a cool job. That was the first time I thought about a career. Like, that would be a cool job, not president, but all of those people working on something so big like Middle East peace. And we got close, and I think we can get close again. So I like to go to the region, build my relationships, understand as much as I possibly can. And, the recent trip was positive in the sense that you're starting to see, or at least I got to see, some of the rebuilding of towns in the Gaza envelope, and a little bit of hope that I hadn't seen in previous trips in terms of folks coming back into these communities that were destroyed, decimated by Hamas on October 7th. And even the Nova Festival, there's now trees, and you can start to see what it's going to be. An incredible tribute to, the lives of the folks that were there. And it's going to be something very powerful for generations. I also took away some frustrations with, where the government is. This is something I share with, folks in the government, and including the prime minister. I believe this war needs to end, and obviously that has to include a hostage deal. But there's a whole bunch of hostage deals I would take. Now I'm not the person in charge of the security and fate of Israel, so take that with a grain of salt. But I would like to see and believe that this war needs to end for a whole host of reasons, and then aid has to surge. We lost a lot of ground after the last ceasefire in terms of getting aid in, and it's the right thing to do. It's the Jewish thing to do, but it's also just strategically what has to happen if Israel is going to maintain its standing in the world and continue to get support. I express those frustrations. You're starting to see aid surge on the Israeli side. Hundreds of trucks are going back in. There needs to be more roads and more distribution centers, more reliable pauses, but you're starting to see all of that come back to life. And that's a very good thing. There's still serious issues with UNRWA that the UN and the international community have not gotten serious about in terms of them being a partner in delivering aid and getting that aid to the people who need it. And there's still limited pressure on Hamas to end this war. And so I appreciated what emerged yesterday as a path forward. It's very similar to a letter I sent to Witkoff a month or two ago saying this is how this all should end. So I was pleased to see a lot of that in there in terms of the fact that the hostages have to be released, the war needs to come to an end. The Arab nations need to coalesce and work with Israel and the Palestinians to develop a legitimate new governing authority in Gaza to begin to remove Hamas militarily, to de-radicalize and to rebuild, and then to get Gaza and this new governing authority on the path to a sustainable peace with Israel. So, I'm hopeful, but I'm a hopeful guy. So,
Thank you, Congressman Jacob. You can go ahead.
Oh, okay.
no,
Wasn't sure.
sorry, I should have teed you up, Jacob.
No, no, no. There's no need. I don't deserve a introduction. Hi everyone. Thanks for having me on. So yeah, I cover mainly as U.S. Bureau Chief the Washington side of things. So was in the White House yesterday for this pretty historic meeting. So every time Netanyahu comes, it's always historic, of course. But fourth time's a charm. This one did seem to be quite unique with the plan that President Trump unveiled. I would agree with the congressman that it's kind of a lot of the concepts of it are not new, but they are. What's unique, I think, right now is that they're succeeding in getting a lot of international support. Not too many things you could imagine seeing Pakistan and Israel agreeing on right now, but the fact is you have Israel getting on board at least initially with this proposal from President Trump. It was 21 points when I got it last week. Now I think it's down to 20. And so Pakistan is one of the countries that's supposed to be kind of giving its guarantorship. We're unclear exactly what that will look like amongst, I think there are 7 other countries in the Arab and Muslim world that have also issued statements welcoming it. And then also on the Israeli side to have Netanyahu get to a yes, which I think was something that took a lot of prodding from the Trump administration. I think it became clear that that was going to be the case in the past several days because I think speaking to aides close to the Witkoff or Kushner that they were planning on really leaning hard on Netanyahu to get him to agree to this proposal. But I think there was a recognition from the Netanyahu side that this is just something that they're not in a position to say no right now to Trump. They don't want to test it. So he said yes, but before doing so, I think he made some very, very significant and secured some very significant amendments to this plan. Because when I obtained it last week before it went live, it didn't have some of these very crucial clauses regarding two issues, which are disarmament of Hamas and the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, which were a lot more vague in the original proposal that Witkoff and Kushner and Tony Blair put together. And what Netanyahu succeeded in doing is getting some very significant wording added regarding benchmarks that will make the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza basically performance-based and based on Hamas disarming, which is a massive red line for Hamas that I'm not sure for sure that they'll be able to agree to, at least in the terms the way that this plan is put together. And the way that Netanyahu was managed to do so was by having the last word with Trump. I think there was a lot of play on this meeting that Trump had last week with these Arab and Muslim countries on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And I think it definitely demonstrated that the Trump administration is taking the advice and guidance of these countries, and it felt like Israel was on the out. But the fact that Netanyahu got the last word, which I think is always important with Trump, before he's if you can get into his ear before he's leaving the room, I think that's the most important time to try to get in touch with him, and that's obviously what happened with this meeting and these meetings that were happening before the White House one, the ones in Bibi's hotel in New York, where Witkoff and Kushner were kind of staying for hours on end to try to get Bibi on board, and those were his conditions to have a more stringent set of terms for when Israel will withdraw. And basically, what you've seen is that Israel is going to be able to theoretically, if Hamas agrees to this plan, and I can get into whether or not that will happen, but if it does, they're going to still remain in control. Israel will of the vast, I think, around 65 to 75% of the Gaza Strip, even after getting all the hostages back. Meaning there's this initial withdrawal that has to take place once the deal is announced, but it's so minimal that Israel's still controlling much of the Strip, and Hamas has given up all of its cards. And because of that, I think it's going to be very difficult to see Hamas accepting the deal on these exact terms. And what I could see is a yes but scenario, which is what we've had before. But the argument to justify the yes but is that basically we had Israel have an opportunity to give its own terms for what it would like to see before the deal was finalized. But Hamas didn't get that opportunity to do so, to have its concerns raised. Now, obviously, one's a U.S. recognized terrorist organization, and one's a state that's in the United Nations for now. I think there's obviously going to be differences in the way that they're treated, but I think you can expect, given that Hamas does have cards to play here in the hostages, that they will be able to get away with saying yes, but Trump did say there's not a lot of room to negotiate here. That I think they would like to see simply them sign on to whatever is proposed. But I think there's recognition, and you even heard it from the Prime Minister of Qatar earlier today, that this U.S. plan is actually somewhat of a draft, and that it does need to be massaged out specifically on the issue of withdrawal, but also probably more crucially is this issue of disarmament, which I think if there's a way to get Hamas to a yes on this, it'll probably have to be a somewhat gradual process as opposed to something more immediate. I think given that Hamas is what makes it unique is it's a resistance organization. So the idea and as in they use weapons in order to advance their cause. So the idea that they're simply going to give it up completely and leave no window for them to at some point come back to this method of advancing the Palestinian cause is hard to believe. But I think what Netanyahu is obviously banking on right now, or possibly banking on, is that it may just come up with a no at the end of the day. I think it saves him from the coalition collapsing. Not that that's a determining factor, because if it was, he wouldn't have said yes. I think elections are going to happen no matter what by the end in the fall of 2026. So whether they happen in the spring or towards the summer, I don't think that's a huge difference. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why he was willing to say yes now as opposed to other times. But I do think this is something that would likely collapse the government. Maybe there's a way Netanyahu can try to make the argument, let's just stay on, don't leave now, we'll get the hostages back, and then I'll back out of the deal, kind of like what he did in January, where they accepted and went into the first phase and then kind of just allowed the deal to collapse after, rather than going into phase two. Maybe that's an argument Netanyahu makes to try to keep this coalition intact. But I think the assumption right now is that you have all this unique you have this unique moment of support from all across the Arab and Muslim world. It's a little bit caveated. If you looked at some of the statements coming out yesterday from the PA and the joint statements from those 8 countries, they said that we support the Trump effort. I think they were not happy with the decision, the changes that the U.S. allowed Netanyahu to put in. And so they didn't say we support this plan, we support the effort instead. But still, I think the hope is that they'll now be able to put a lot of pressure on Hamas to agree to it. What I think needs to be remembered, though, at the same time, is that yes, they do have a degree of influence over the Hamas officials in Qatar. The ones making the decision at the end of the day are the ones in Gaza, and I'm not convinced that this is just a matter of if we squeeze Hamas hard enough, if Qatar and Egypt and Turkey just do that, then Hamas will have no choice but to say yes. I think the leadership in Gaza is very hard line, and they do want to be able to maintain some semblance of authority or control in Gaza, even if it's not as the government. So I think we're not talking about a above 50% chance of this deal being approved by Hamas, or even if it's likely to be a yes, but then where talks happen from there, I think it's a long shot. But I think this, again, the unique circumstance of all this international support, kind of similar to what we had after Biden presented his plan in May 31st of 2024, that maybe can help. That didn't work at the time, but again, I do think that plays a role. So we'll have to see, as Trump says.
Thank you, Jacob. That was an extremely comprehensive view of the events of the last 24, 36 hours. You really touched on a lot of the points I would have asked questions about. So with that in mind, I'm going to go first to Congressman Landsman with the first question. You mentioned that this was your sixth trip in some 30-ish months since you joined Congress. What was different from this trip that you saw, that you heard from previous visits that you made to the region?
I try to touch on that, in my opening remarks, because it's now been a couple of months, but I was really taken by some of the changes I saw in the South. I had been to Kfar Aza a couple times, and and others, and you're starting to see that rebuilding happening,
Mhm.
um, and people talking about coming back. That hadn't been the case in my previous trip, so that was hopeful. And just seeing those trees in the Nova, festival site it's just very powerful. It's just, you can tell that it's going to be iterative. They're going to continue to build on it, in a way that I think will be very meaningful for the country, and the healing process, which is going to be necessary. I mean, I don't believe the country has yet to heal, and I don't think the country can start that healing and grieving process until the hostages are home and the war's over. So, I do think that there is, you know, uh, a real desire to see this come to an end. I think there's, a resolve, obviously, to get the hostages home and to end the horrible terror reign of Hamas. There's also, I think the interest in getting folks their family members back home for good. Whether they're reservists or otherwise. I think folks want to have their entire family home, and it's caused a lot of negative pressure on the economy, and so yeah, I think there's a desire to see this be done, um, and uh, you know uh, I I can speak from my own experience here in that. I think that there's also that it's a different kind of exhaustion, but there is an increasing desire. You see it in the polling for this war to be over. And, it's a balancing act for the prime minister to be sure. And putting the coalition politics aside, just the fact that, like, you want it to be over, but you also have to ensure that Hamas does not continue to govern. Now, I'm a big believer in cutting a deal, getting a deal done, getting the hostages home. Like, I just think you have to do that, and going back in, even if you're only I mean, I think you just sort of move back to the perimeter. But even if you had to leave, as I've said, you can go back in. You went back, they went back in after the ceasefire. Nobody stopped them. I just think it's important to get these hostages out and home. And the second thing that I just think hasn't been fully leveraged is the the investment that these Arab countries are willing to make if the Trump administration really leans on them. And that's what I would be doing if I were president, is really leaning on them to be all in a very structured, formal way, and constant pressure on Hamas, including Qatar pulling in these Hamas leaders in Qatar to, detain them until this is over. Like, I think maximum leverage, maximum pressure at this point, but get all 22, all of them involved in a very formal and committed, long-term, sustainable way. And I think that helps achieve the goals that we collectively have for ending this war and getting Gaza to a place where Hamas is gone, the strip is de-radicalized, and we're in a position to help them rebuild with a new governing authority that wants peace with the state of Israel.
Thank you, Congressman. Jacob, we have a question for you from Shira. She asks that if Hamas refuses the deal, which she feels is likely, she understands that the plan provides for a partial implementation in the areas controlled by Israel. In that scenario, is there a path envisioned for getting the remaining hostages out under a partial implementation? And you're currently muted.
Thank you. I would say the plan itself does not provide for a path of how the hostages would be released in that scenario. I do think that there will be subsequent attempts to try to secure the release of the hostages. I don't think any of the parties involved are interested in just allowing them to languish there. But I don't think this plan itself. I assume I did speak with an Arab diplomat who said that scenario is very possible, and what eventually could end up happening would be simply that you'll theoretically have a deal that's just a hostage deal itself, and doesn't expand to actually the other parts of the post-war management of Gaza. I do think it'll be less likely to implement any of this plan if Hamas says no. I know that there's that clause is in there about we can actually move forward regardless, but I think just the notion of seeing some of these Arab or Muslim countries actually willing to put troops in Gaza to start working to disarm Hamas feels a little bit on the more fantasy end. Um, there's been general agreement from these countries to say, yeah, we're on board. But when they haven't been specifically asked to start sending troops or say that they will. So I think that's going to
Hey,
be
Kathy Manning.
more difficult to happen.
Sorry, Jacob.
Okay.
By the way, I agree with Jacob on all of those things, and would just add that, like, this is why, if it were me, this is what I thought about all night. Uh, I just would dedicate an entire team to this. Like, it can't just be Witkoff and a few other people. Like, you got to have an entire team, and you got to get, ironclad commitments from all of these countries. It's got to be formal. They've got to come together in a formal, sustainable way, because if everyone starts doing other things in the White House, this thing, becomes really nothing pretty quickly. If Hamas says no, which is the most likely scenario, though, fingers crossed.
I also could see a scenario where they say yes, but, and then Israel is the one that turns around and is not willing to accept
Yeah.
Hamas's terms. And I think it'll be interesting to see the case that some of these Arab mediating countries make to Trump, whether who they want to blame. Obviously, I think the general interest of the U.S. is to blame Hamas and not Israel. But I think there's also a very close relationship between the U.S. and Qatar, and I think they do have some sway over how the Trump administration sees these issues.
Definitely. Jacob, I'm going to go back to you again. Lisa asks, Hamas indicated that they had not seen the deal before the press conference. They had expected it to be properly submitted to them. Do you believe that the Trump administration had not gotten any indications from Hamas before announcing how historic and far-reaching this deal is? Assuming they do not accept the deal, assuming they do accept the deal, how realistic is the pathway to a new governing authority, including Trump and Blair on a peace board and a de-radicalized Palestinian leadership?
Also,
Okay.
what does proper way mean? Do you know, Jacob? What is the
Can you
proper way?
repeat the question again? There's some
Yeah.
Yeah,
noise behind me.
sure. So there's two pieces to it. A, do you believe that the Trump administration had not gotten any indications from Hamas before announcing, given how historic and far-reaching this
Yes.
deal is? And two, assuming they accept the deal, how realistic is the pathway to a new governing authority, including Trump and Blair on a peace board and a de-radicalized Palestinian leadership?
Okay, so on whether they got, so it is accurate that Hamas wasn't formally presented this proposal before the press conference. I, I am told that uh, I passed along, after I published the plan last week, I'm told that it did reach them at that point.
Hmm.
But formally correct, they weren't. My understanding is that I think Trump got some assurance from the Qataris and the Egyptians that they thought that they could get Hamas on board, but that was before the changes that were made by Netanyahu over the weekend. From like I think it was starting with a meeting in New York on Thursday and then another one on Sunday, when some of those changes were implemented that I don't think Qatar and Egypt were comfortable with in terms of how they think they can bring Hamas to say yes to. Um, so I think that was what one of the reasons why Trump felt confident. I also think that they're just trying to will this over the finish line. So that's on whether how much Hamas or in terms of that issue. Second question about the likelihood of this Blair Committee of Peace in terms of the word proper, Congressman. This was written not by the most legal expert. I don't know.
No, it
I think
was
we're
because Hamas said they hadn't received it properly. Like, what
oh
is
properly
properly?
means just by formal official channels. So
Yeah.
I think at this point they have now
Okay.
because I think because the word proper was also in the plan. I think
Gotcha.
also I was confused what it was. But yeah, they had a meeting and calls and meetings last night and today with the head of the intelligence,
I gotcha.
General Rashad of the Egyptians, and also the Qatari Prime Minister, and I think the Turkish intelligence chief is also in Doha right now. So everyone's kind of congregating in Doha to try to get this up and running. And that I think now they've been properly informed. As for this this board of peace that Trump is going to be chairing, I think what I can say is that there was pushback from Arab stakeholders about having Blair be the one to head it. I think I guess there's some discomfort with him in some of these capitals. So there were I think what Arab countries had hoped is that there would be a Palestinian actually of sorts to head this committee. But I guess once Blair was not the person that was accepted, I think the White House kind of ran with this idea that Trump would do it. And it seems like it could be in perpetuity. Like I guess Trump could be the governor of Gaza until he dies, which is an interesting concept to think about. But in terms of its success, all this stuff is a bit of a long shot. I think again, the fact that you have at least now some degree of buy-in from all these different countries, that's unique. But it's going to require, as I think the congressman mentioned, a lot of heavy lifting from the U.S. and more than one person on this team, because I don't think Trump's going to be getting into the weeds on these issues, and Witkoff's doing a million things at the same time. So I think it will be important to have a lot of the U.S. leadership, because one of the main conditions for a lot of these countries to be involved is not just a pathway to a Palestinian state and a credible one, which I'm also not completely sure that this plan really offers, definitely the way that Netanyahu talks about it, but is just U.S. involvement and leadership. So I think that will be critical in terms of getting this up and running.
Definitely. Thank you. Congressman Landsman, how are Democrats in Congress responding to this proposal, and how do you think that proposal Democrats should feel about it?
I haven't talked to many Democrats since it just happened. I mean, we're up here on the Hill, though not officially because we don't have votes. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a likely shutdown tonight. I hope that, that there's support for ending this war and getting the hostages back, and that there's a sort of day after vision. Israel's had enormous success, obviously, against Hezbollah. The situation in Syria has changed dramatically for the better. Uh, you know, Syria's success with Iran. I mean, things have changed very significantly in a really positive direction. It's Gaza that's got to get resolved, and I think support is, yeah, I think that you will see people who will support this getting done, and so yeah, I my my sense of those who are struggling and or have been critical, I'm not sure they understand that, like, being critical of Bibi Netanyahu is one thing. Like, being critical of the government is fine. That's Israelis do that. That's is entirely appropriate. We're as Americans, we're critical of our government, and that's what liberal, healthy democracies do. So that's fine. What isn't positive or helpful, in fact, could be hurtful, is saying to all of these enemies, and there are enemies too, we're going to limit our support to the state of Israel. That's where things get really problematic and sort of embolden Hamas and embolden Hezbollah and embolden Iran when they're all on their heels, right? Like, this could be the end of this terror network, and we can finally get peace. So don't give them any more energy. And by saying, "Hey, we're going to withhold aid," or we're going to unilaterally, call for a Palestinian state, which exists where, like, is that all of Israel? Like, what are we talking about? That suggests to Hamas, "Hey, maybe we should keep fighting." And I don't think that's their intent. I think they just have a hard time understanding that it's entirely appropriate to be critical of the government and decisions, and to say, "Hey, I would do this differently," or "I want them to go in a different direction," which the administration is saying to Bibi Netanyahu, without abandoning our ally. And I think that's where I'm trying to steer folks, is to say, look, I get the frustration and the concern and the deep desire to have this end. Voice that opinion, like, be loud, get over there, go talk to them, and work with the administration to get this thing done. But we don't abandon our allies.
Yes. Congressman, you alluded to the fact how current calls to condition aid, and calls to recognize a Palestinian state are the wrong actions to take, and how that's kind of a result of the ongoing frustration that Democrats have as this war comes upon its second year. If this war does indeed end, what is the pathway back for Democrats in Congress and for the party more broadly?
I think it's pretty clear, the path. I mean, I think it's a clear path. Israel seeking peace is very popular outside of Israel. Israel seeking land, I mean, like, the annexation of the West Bank is deeply unpopular in Israel and over here. And so, yeah, once we get on the other side of this, and we have a government that's really actively pursuing peace, then the path for a lot of these folks who have felt alienated to come back, I think, is pretty clear. I don't know, Kathy, do you guys, am I being Pollyannish, or Jacob? Like, I think part of it is the war has to end. Part of it is that there's probably got to be a new leader. Um, uh, and I'm assuming that Bibi knows that this is the end of the road anyways, right? Like, I don't think he expects to win another election. And whether the election is in the spring or the fall, I agree with Jacob. It's still about to happen. So this coalition's days are coming to an end. and a government that is working on peace. And peace through strength, don't get me wrong, because you do have to take out these terror armies and you have to marginalize, completely sideline Iran as a threat, which is going to require constant work, and this coalition, in my opinion. But that becomes a very popular Israel.
Great. Now, you also mentioned in your previous remarks that you're up on the Hill and there's a looming government shutdown. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention this at all. Where do the negotiations currently stand, and kind of what are the sticking points?
Well, the sticking point is that there are no negotiations. That is the sticking point. The president doesn't want to negotiate. He said, as much a week or two ago, don't negotiate with Democrats. Had he said, go ahead and negotiate with Democrats, the majority leader and the speaker would do just that. They do what he says, and I don't mean that in like a negative. I do mean that in a negative way, but it is also just true. Like, I don't think they would disagree. Like, if the president says go negotiate a deal with Democrats, that they would go do that. But he said the exact opposite. They met for about an hour and a half yesterday. It wasn't a negotiation. The president, sort of listened. I think some of this was more new to him than people would have realized, particularly the healthcare issues. There's about 22 million people in the United States whose healthcare costs are going to go up if the ACA subsidies expire, and there's bipartisan support to extend those for another year or two, and he could get a deal done. But at the moment, I don't think he wants that, and so there'll be a shutdown, and it ends when I think he says, "Okay, let's go ahead and put people in a room," and I suspect that it just takes some movement on these healthcare investments, and we got a deal.
Awesome. Thank you. Jacob, I've got a question for you from Michael. We alluded to some of the challenges within Bibi's own right-wing coalition with folks like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. What role did the demonstrations by protesters in Israel play, and how does that pressure feed into Bibi's calculus when he thinks about this deal?
Good question.
Yeah, I would say the protests have had almost no influence on Netanyahu. Um, I think there was, if you recall, after Gallant was when he tried to fire Gallant the first time, there were these overnight protests. I think I knew people on the way right of the political spectrum that were taking part in them.
And the
And that
pilots.
was something. Say again?
And the pilots. Remember the
Yeah. So that was, I think it was more widespread, but I think they've been able to since gradually peg these protests as just like part of this broader left-wing conspiracy, deep state to oust him. And I think people are fatigued, and there's only so much they can do when the coalition is a stable 64, 68, whatever it's going to be, depending on the one we're talking in the past. Um, that at the end of the day, they don't have the majority to really bring down the government. So yes, they can get tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people on a given Saturday night. But I think the government has been able to kind of dismiss it as something that's just part of this broader left wing opposition, and not something that's more widespread. But it does have influence over Trump to a degree, and Trump mentioned it in his remarks yesterday uh, during the press conference with Netanyahu, talking about how recognizing that this is a very popular thing for Netanyahu to do. And even almost suggesting, like, I get, Bibi, this isn't something you want to do because you're a warrior, but now is the time to do peace. And it's not just peace, but it's like popular because the people in Israel want this. I see these protests outside in the streets, and they're calling for three things. They're calling for an end of the war, the release of the hostages, and for me to get involved, because there's been a lot of these signs that you'll see at these protests that are appealing to Trump. There's a recognition pretty much everywhere in the world that only Trump can get this deal done. At least that's how it's seen. And he's the only one that can move Netanyahu. And I guess there's some truth to that if we're looking at what happened yesterday. So I think that's where it's still apparently there's still some weight. I think maybe I don't want to dismiss it completely on the domestic angle, because I obviously think it's an important part of free speech and for people to feel like they are able to make a difference. I just think the way that it's been carried out over the past year or so, it's just become something that Netanyahu has been able to marginalize. The last thing I was just thinking about when the congressman was speaking regarding how Democrats, specifically pro-Israel Democrats, are trying to meet this moment, it just reminded me that I was at a conference earlier this year. I won't get too specific because it was off record. And a Democratic congressperson was interviewed on stage about just the policy and the war in Gaza, and they were asked about the joint resolution of disapproval that Bernie Sanders brought forward, and whether or not they were in the Senate or the House. I won't get too specific. Whether or not they would wait. Why didn't they? Could they imagine supporting this concept? And this congressperson was adamant that they would not do something like this, even though at the same time they were basically arguing somewhat similar to Congressman Landsman is saying, is that this war needs to end. And this was before obviously the Trump peace plan came out. And then they were pushed. Okay, but if you think the war needs to end and that this war is being prosecuted in a way that's not just, and that Palestinian civilians are being killed we're at 65, 70,000 at this point, even if obviously there's a large amount of them are fighters, but there's quite a few civilians being killed. If you feel this way, why can't you get behind something like what Sanders is pushing? And the response was, well, Iran's this major threat, and if we do this, Iran could maybe capitalize on the moment. And the response by the questioner was like, okay, but we're talking about this war in Gaza right now. If you think this war is unjust, why aren't you supporting withholding weapons just for being used in Gaza? And this went on 4 times, I think, of the question basically being dodged. And eventually the congressperson said, you're right, I don't know why this war is being fought. And then the reporter said, and at this point you could hear a pin drop. And the questioner said, okay, but why are you not supporting this legislation? And the final response was, well, I will never stop supporting Israel. I will always support its right to self-defense. And everyone started clapping because that's where the kind of conference it was. But it was not an impressive case for how to, I think, justify continued support for Israel. And I think it was just telling to me how difficult it's becoming for Democrats who want to do so. That was just something that came to mind that I thought might be worth sharing.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
By the way, I just, I think that's very helpful, and I can imagine it. And you did a nice job of disguise. I actually don't know who it is. And I get the issue. I think most people would say this is a just war, though. I mean, I don't know if that was language that he or she used, but most people would say this is a just war. It just needs to end. Like it needs to come to an end. And that withholding aid does undermine our ally in a way that is really significant. And
Yeah, no, I think there's an easy case to make. It was shocking to me that this person wasn't really
oh,
completely able to make it
yeah, no, I mean it's
if you're
harder.
going to be taking these very controversial stances at this point within the party. But I do think objectively it is a harder case to make as this war drags on.
Yeah.
Definitely. We're going to go to our final question, and we'll hear from both of you on this one before we close out. Trump suggested during the press conference yesterday that Iran might join the Abraham Accords. We also might recall that potentially,
I didn't know that.
yes, interesting stuff. We also recall that this kind of war began under some folks having the pretense that the desire of Hamas was to scuttle the Saudi Arabia Abraham Accords deal with Israel. Assuming that this peace deal goes through and we are able to get back, what are your folks' prospects for whether that's a two-state solution or additional signers onto the Abraham Accords, but additional regional cooperation? And we'll go to you, Jacob, first. Kind of, what is possible if this deal is able to go through?
Yeah, so Trump mentioned 3 countries as I guess one could argue as his main candidates. I think he said from Syria to Lebanon to Saudi Arabia. And my thought process is, okay, he's like trying to do in the order of what's most likely. And I think each of them have reasons why I actually don't think they're very likely at this moment. Syria, I think and Lebanon are both young governments that are trying to be stood up and gain legitimacy, and I think they're just not in a position right now to simply take that massive step that requires a lot of already existing legitimacy that they don't have. There are efforts to try to reach some sort of security arrangement between Israel and Syria that will kind of be similar to what we had in 1974. Um, Basically, just security arrangements, making sure that the border stays kind of calm. Um, there was some hope in the Trump administration that that would be able to happen sooner than it has. I think with Netanyahu, it's always going to be very difficult. But maybe closer to the election, I think maybe that could be something, some sort of ploy that, or not gimmick, but something that he'll be able to try to sell. And so maybe you could have a deal around then. Um, and then Lebanon too, but short of normalization is where I'll stop on Syria. Lebanon too, I think it's just a very fragile situation there with this new government. I think there's elections that are happening in May of next year that are important to be watching out for in Lebanon, because right now the government is passing, or the Prime Minister Naif Salem is passing or pushing through this disarmament of Hezbollah plan. But theoretically, if Israel doesn't, or the region doesn't play its cards right, we could have a new government in Lebanon that's not as welcoming to this idea of pushing out Iranian influence. But to expect them at this state to normalize ties with Israel, I think is we're jumping the gun. And then on Saudi Arabia, I'm just recalling speaking to a Saudi official months and months ago, but just this feeling that there's the Saudis, I think, were more interested in this idea, or at least MBS. I think when Israel was seen as a country that was forward looking, the startup nation that I think is enticing to a lot of investors more broadly. But I think what's been happening over the past few years is that there's this perception, at least in Saudi Arabia, that the country is going backwards. And if that's the case, they're not really as interested as I think those who are pushing the Abraham Accords would like to think. And I think it's going to take a long time. And they're not joking about this credible pathway to a Palestinian state, which is something that Netanyahu is pretty adamant about not allowing to move forward. So I think that's more unlikely. But there are countries that I think who have different priorities, like Indonesia, where we saw their president at the UN say shalom and talk about the importance of Israeli security. That is something I'm not as well versed in Indonesian politics, but it just seems like it's something, at least when I speak to people who are a little bit more familiar with these issues, that could be a more realistic option. And there are other examples like that actually out of the region of the Middle East, but still would be pretty significant. Indonesia being the largest Muslim country in terms of population. So that's the kind of country that you could see, but it's going to require the war in Gaza to end. I don't really see any of these things happening without it.
Definitely. Congressman?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, I'm more hopeful in part because, I do think these things do have to be willed, and so, the only disposition in this is to be hopeful and to push for this and to be optimistic that it will happen, because that's the only way it's going to happen, is if we all believe in it. And there's reason to believe in the sense that, you know, despite the fact that we're now getting to, 2 years of a war that we knew would be long, but not this long. Um, and Israel's standing in the international community has been diminished, which is a key strategy for Hamas. And this is one of the reasons why I think Netanyahu's got to figure out a way to end this war, because Hamas is succeeding at delegitimizing Israel in a way that is really harmful, way more so than anything they can do militarily. And so, I think you got to take that off the table, and that means ending the war. And when I said surging aid, like, I think my understanding it's got to be 500-600 trucks. But the issue really is getting aid, not into Gaza, but around to folks. I think you want to get so much aid in that Hamas has nowhere to sell aid. It's just like there's no market for stolen Hamas aid. But ultimately, if you can get these Arab countries organized in a structured way where they start to have shared work, and you build on that and build on that and build on that, I do think that's a group that then finds legitimacy in the partnership with each other, and their strength in numbers, and it's easier for them to sell, making additional progress with Israel back home when you're doing it as part of this larger group. And so that's why I think, formalizing this coalition is so important, and giving that coalition a lot to go work on together. And whatever they're willing to do now, go do that. And then whatever they're willing to do next, have them do that, and so on and so forth. And you just keep building and building and building and building. And, again, this is way too easy in terms of simplifying something that's incredibly complicated. But an Israel that's seeking peace, and you have to do so while also getting rid of terror. But an Israel seeking peace is quite popular, and I think that's what MBS would support. And once this war is over, and there is a pathway to peace, because these terror armies have been defeated, the network's been, and they're being dismantled. I think these folks do come back and say, okay, let's be part of something.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman Landsman, and thank you, Jacob. I'm now going to turn it over to DMFI's board co-chair, Kathy Manning, to say a few words if she'd like.
Thank you, Joel. I want to thank my good friend, Representative Greg Landsman and Jacob Magid, for their insightful and informative remarks. Jacob, thank you for your reporting. I listen to you almost every morning on the Times of Israel podcast, so thank you for keeping me updated. Greg, let me just say how lucky we are to have you in Congress. I appreciate your deep knowledge of this issue, and frankly, your eloquence in expressing and explaining the situation and the priorities that we and the Democrats in Congress ought to have. I also want to say I agree with you. Democrats have been deeply supportive of Israel and the Israeli people for 75 years now. Many still are. For those who are deeply critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu and how he is conducting this war, let me just say, this is where DMFI comes in. We have a lot of work to do. Hopefully, this war will be over soon, and we can go about the job of educating members of Congress, educating their staff, making sure that the Democratic Party remains pro-Israel, because Israel must remain a bipartisan issue. That's why at DMFI, we're actually undertaking a new strategic plan that will allow us to grow DMFI to meet the challenges that we're facing in the region, as well as on Capitol Hill. And let me just tell all of you on this webinar, we need your help doing this. DMFI is supported entirely by generous individual donors. Your gift, DMFI, will help us meet the challenges before us, as well as the ones to come. And you can scan the QR code on your screen or go to dmfi.org to make a gift. Let me just say, over the next few days, we have some additional time for reflection, for self-evaluation, for thinking how we want to work to make the world a better place over the next year. And I wish all of you an easy fast and a sweet, meaningful, and peaceful new year. Thank you all.